This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We are joined today by fuel specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, Luke Berning, for a two-part conversation on prescribed burns this year. In this first segment, Luke discusses the history of prescribed burns in Kansas, their benefits, and the importance of understanding the types of plants in your area before burning. In part two, Luke shares insight on how this year really differs from past years, and that advice for the eastern two-thirds of the state really differs from the western third due to ongoing drought conditions. The advice he shares is so insightful and definitely not a conversation you will want to miss out on. We end with this week's horticulture segment, where K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, discusses the importance of taking soil temperature readings prior to planting early season crops. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by one of our friends from the Kansas Forest Service. His name is Luke Berning, and he serves as their fuel specialist. So we're going to be discussing today some prescribed burning topics of interest, I guess, as we think about this year specifically, 2023, following up on a drought season. So before we get into that, Luke, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Prescribed burning, when we think about it as a whole, it's got a long history here in Kansas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have extremely solid evidence that Native Americans have been burning for thousands of years. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Just like cattle, bison were drawn to those areas of green, nutritious, palatable grass. You know, prior to the 1600s, there weren't horses on the plains. The Native Americans moved on foot. And so it makes a lot of sense. It was to their advantage to burn off areas because it would bring the bison to them. They didn't have to travel as far. So, yeah, our system here on the prairies is adapted to fire.
Wonderful. Well, now that we know a bit about the background on prescribed burning, you mentioned there obviously the benefits for Native Americans years and years and years ago. But today, what are the benefits of burning as we know it?
So the important distinction to draw here is there's a lot of benefits that can be had by using prescribed fire, but it has to be applied appropriately. So if you're applying it appropriately, you can increase your foliar nutrition on your grass that's out there. You can increase the vigor of your desired species. They'll outcompete, species that aren't favorable for fire. You can set back undesired species like Sericea, dogwood, locust, old world bluestem. The key here is that it has to be applied appropriately. You have to know your plant community. You have to know your local conditions because all these things play into how that fire affects your plant community out there. If you burn at the wrong time, you can have the exact opposite effect. You can reduce the nutrition. You can set back your production of grass for multiple years. You know, in the short grass prairie, if you burn at the wrong time, if you burn during a drought period, it can take up to 3 years for you to recover your production tonnage in your grasslands. And so knowing what you have and the most appropriate way for that grassland to be managed with fire is how you can make sure that you're not leaving something on the table and you're not harming your pastures.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned timing there being so key when it comes to these prescribed burns. So in a typical year, when do these prescribed burns usually take place? This is my first year, so I know it's burning season, but what does that really mean?
Well, we're about to kick off. So kind of traditionally, at least here in the Flint Hills, the end of March and beginning of April is really when things start to light up. Here in the Flint Hills, we'll actually burn about 2 million acres over the course of 3 to 5 days.
Wow.
There's just those specific days where the conditions are right and just, everything goes. And so that traditional burn period comes from some research that was published here in 1968 at K-State. And that research showed that late March, early April time frame resulted in the greatest gains for stalker calves on their units here. I do want to note that some recent research out of the stalker unit here at K-State has proven that alternate burn windows can bring identical gains along with the beneficial side effects of, if you have Sericea, controlling Sericea, old world bluestem, and doing a better job of controlling brush. So this goes back to knowing your plant community. The traditional time frame might be the right choice for you, but the more we learn, we're learning that we can still have a productive cattle operation, and also receive other benefits if we consider other options.
Sure. You used the term alternate control windows, I think there was what you said. What does that really mean?
So what we're talking about there, it depends for your property, but a lot of what's being looked at and the research is focusing on right now are what we call growing season burns. And so that's late summer, early fall. And so where you land in there, it depends on what you have going on your specific property. But yeah, compared to traditional burns, that might be a good option for some.
Excellent. Good to know. So you mentioned earlier that, prescribed burns, it's not something you can just attempt without having a good background of knowledge on it, right? So when it comes to doing prescribed burning in Kansas, are there special permits involved to be able to do these?
It varies by county, but generally what I've seen in Kansas is that at a minimum, you're going to have to call dispatch and let them know where you're burning. And the thought behind that is that somebody's going to call it in. There's going to say that, there's a smoke plume over there, and then the dispatcher can respond. They can look and say, oh, you know what, we have a prescribed fire going on over there on Road A, and it's under control. And so that way they don't have to send out more than likely volunteer firefighters out to something that is not an issue. And so at a minimum, call in dispatch, but it varies by county. Some counties you have to go in and physically get a permit. So on that, it's just referring to your local regulations, and often those will be posted on the county's website.
Excellent. Good to know for sure. And under normal conditions, which we'll get into this later, this year's not really normal by any means, but under normal conditions, what tips do you typically have for producers when they're planning for prescribed burns this time of year?
Man, so I know it's redundant, but I'm a natural resources guy. That's my background. So I'm going to say it again. You've got to know your plant community. You could be leaving benefits on the table if you just do what you have traditionally done. So know your plant community, and then make sure you're following recommendations for your area. Something that I've been learning a lot about is how fire behaves across the state. And so if you're in the mixed grass or the short grass prairie, you're going to need different recommendations for how to burn, when to burn, what conditions you want to have than in the tall grass. And so a tip that I would have for folks that are going to be burning this spring is make sure that the recommendations you're following are tailored for your part of the state. And then another one would be, especially if you're interested in starting prescribed fire, if you're interested in getting started, take advantage of prescribed burn associations. So these are groups of landowners in defined areas that work together to burn each member's property. If you're just getting started, if you're on the fence about burning, you need to do it. It would help your pasture out, but you're concerned about pulling it off safely. Being involved with the Prescribed Burn Association will help you get a professional burn plan. It brings a bunch of people in to help you burn and can help you get a lot of experience on the fire line in a quick amount of time.
Absolutely. So more of a team effort. I'm sure, many producers have teams that they normally put together, but that even adds to your resources available in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. So, yeah, you mentioned the diversity of areas of the state here in Kansas. I was talking to someone recently where they're like, yeah, we have 8 different types of environments really across the entirety of Kansas. That's quite unique for our state. So I'm sure it complicates these things a lot.
Oh, yeah. The change in ecotypes that we have across the state is wild.
Change, I guess, of environment, period. In the last year, we've experienced an ongoing drought, and that's still kind of the conditions we're dealing with now in a lot of areas. So with that in mind, how does that kind of change recommendations this year specifically? So
it varies based on where you're at in the state. Going back a little bit to what we talked about earlier, in the western third of the state where we have, short grass and transitional mixed grass prairie, I would be very cautious to burn it all this year. There's some really good research that the Forest Service did in the northeast corner of New Mexico in the short grass, and it showed that when they burned that prairie during a drought year, that's when it takes, 3 years for them to get back up to normal production levels. And so if you're in that area of the state, I would really consider postponing prescribed fire for this year. Prescribed fire isn't a button we hit every time. Sometimes it's just not the right choice. And so for the western third of the state, I would definitely be cautious about burning this year. I also want to note that what they found is spring burns are the only time in the short grass that you get positive results. So I just want to say growing season burns aren't really an option for the western third of the state for that short grass prairie area. But back to the drought effects. In the eastern two-thirds, in this part of the state, drought doesn't necessarily rule out fire like it does in the west. Already this spring, most of the eastern two-thirds of the state has gotten enough moisture to make burning positive. We've had several shots of rain that have hit a lot of areas. But that said, how we burn is going to have to change if we want to keep it safe. And so our heavy fuels, the cedar trees, down logs, structures, are extremely dry right now. In the fire science world, we classify fuels by the amount of time it takes for them to reach equilibrium with the surrounding atmosphere. For instance, your grasses are 1 hour fuels. If it's 50% humidity in the morning and it dumps down to 15%, that grass will dry out very quickly. Our heavier fuels are called 1,000 hour fuels. So it takes about 42 days of wet weather for their internal moisture levels to recover. And so even though we've gotten some moisture lately, those fuels, those heavy fuels, are still extremely dry. And so specifically talking about cedar trees, I expect to see some extraordinary torching behavior when fire hits cedars this spring. Practically, that means that you need to consider if this cedar patch or individual cedar starts torching and sending up embers, will they be carried outside of your burn unit? Sometimes it's inevitable. I would just expect more cedar trees to actually catch and flare up than normal. And so just be considerate of where you're sending your embers.
We're cutting to a short break now, but our advice from Luke doesn't end here on prescribed burns this year in Kansas. We'll be back with more advice from him ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with fuel specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, Luke Berning. He's joining us for a conversation on prescribed burns, and we'll continue with his advice now.
I also expect to see a lot more fire creeping through our timbered riparian areas and causing escapes. I've done it for sure, running fire into the timber and letting it, it hits the timber and goes out. Don't count on that this year. Really put in a decent fire line, at least slow that fire down before and be prepared to sit on that fire and make sure that it is out in that timber. And then another tip with that, when you're in an area that maybe you have to run the fire through some cedars, and maybe, you're not in an area where you're going to be sending embers into outside of the burn unit, but you still want to be careful. What I would recommend there is reduce your flame intensity and heat when it hits those heavy fuels. So practically what that looks like is if you've got a cedar or a log or, whatever it is that you're concerned about, take your mower out there, take a weed eater out, and just cut the grass short around there. So instead of having 5-6 foot flames, you have 8-inch flames, and that'll reduce the likelihood of catching those heavy fuels on fire. Another option with that is hitting it before you burn. If it's in a safe place to do this, you could essentially conduct a back burn around those fuels. And so you're lighting them first before this intense flame front gets to it. Again, you're just reducing the intensity of fire when it does touch that fuel and reducing the heat to try and keep your fire behavior a little bit lower intensity. I think we're going to see some pretty extreme fire behavior. So anything we can do to help moderate that intensity is worth considering. Another thing that I really want to emphasize is that producers should be conducting a test fire before they send fire across the whole pasture. So the purpose of a test fire is to accurately gauge what fire behavior is going to be like before it is too late to stop. So if you've never done one before, what you do is find a spot that has the same fuels as your burn unit in a spot where you can easily stop it. You could do this by taking a small corner of your pasture, putting in a mowed line around a quarter acre or so, and then using that plot to gauge how the rest of the unit will behave. In a year where fire weather may be less predictable than it has been in the past, this practice is going to be crucial, guys. Another consideration is humidity levels. If in the past you used 30% RH as your bottom number, consider bumping it up 5 or 10% to help moderate that behavior.
With those pre-burning tips that you just offered, how early should producers be taking those into account before their actual planned burn?
Whenever you have time. If you leave it until the week of, things are going to break, and it's not going to happen like you want it to happen. And so if you have time, start today. You know, we still have a good 15 days, 20 days until we really get into the swing of things. So there's some time yet to still take precautions now so that later you aren't kicking yourself.
Absolutely. And I'm kind of backtracking here a little bit, but you mentioned our friends in the West. This might not be the year for them to be taking prescribed burns into their own production systems. But are there alternatives for them in this case other than prescribed burns for kind of maintaining those grasslands or prairie areas?
Yeah, it depends on what you have going on. And that's a great point, that prescribed fire is just a tool in the toolbox. It's a very efficient tool. We can impact a lot of acres really quickly and inexpensively compared to using chemical or mechanical methods. But, you know, I think it depends on what your concern is for your property out there. You know, if you're someone who's concerned about wildfire risk and you're wanting to reduce your fuels and, you know, you wish you could burn to reduce your fuels, but it's not going to happen this year, that's where mechanical treatment can really come into play. So what treatment you use and how you do it really depends on the property. But that's definitely a great point, to not just get stuck in the prescribed fire lane. There's a lot of ways to manage your property, and it's worth considering all of them.
So some of those options may be like grazing livestock in an area you normally wouldn't, or actually going through and bush hogging an area per se, or some other things of that nature? Yeah,
I think your mower could be your best friend, cattle. Another thing, if you're concerned about fuels, is how can you get green on the ground? You know, green helps slow down fires. So, you know, if you're concerned with fire danger around your homestead or your headquarters, where do you have wheat planted? Could you put in a strip around the edge of the pasture to slow it down? So you can get really creative with slowing down fires and creating fuel breaks. And you know, we at the Forest Service, wildfire is really our focus in the fire program. A lot of the prescribed fire that we do is to reduce wildfire risk. And so if that's something you are really concerned about, talk to me. We can share my contact information. That's what I do. You know, I love prescribed fire for natural resources, but my focus is helping folks protect their homes and lands from catastrophic wildfires. So if that's something you're concerned about and you want another opinion on what you can do to protect yourself, protect your property and your family, that's what I'm here for.
You just led into my final question here perfectly, Luke. It was just, what resources are really out there for Kansans that are worried about wildfires this year or just maintaining their land? What resources should they really look into this time of year?
It's cool because we have a lot of resources. You know, we recently had a conference, KNRC, the Kansas Natural Resources Conference, and it's just really cool to sit and, man, there's folks from all across the state who are experts in this stuff. And so specifically some resources is within the Kansas Forest Service. Myself and Dennis Carlson make up the fuels mitigation unit, and so we cover statewide fuels management. We also have district fire management officers across the state that are experts in fire behavior, and they can all help landowners with implementing prescribed fire. We can put a link to our website in the show notes, so if folks are interested in that route, they can get that information there. Additionally, outside of KFS, like I said, there's so many experts in this field in Kansas. So, for example, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks has private lands biologists. There's natural resource specialists with the NRCS, and then biologists with NGOs like Pheasants Forever and the Kansas Grazing Lands Coalition. Local PBAs are also a great resource if you're wanting to learn more. We can include a link to learning more about PBAs as well. Lastly, if you are interested in learning about prescribed fire on your own, the Kansas Prescribed Fire Council has a lot of great videos that you can watch and educate yourself about prescribed fire. The Great Plains Fire Science Exchange has an incredible amount of easy-to-follow information on literally any topic concerning prescribed fire in the Great Plains. I use both of those extensively, and that's one way that you can really learn what your plant community is and how it's going to interact with fire. Another good tool for learning about the plant community and how it interacts is actually the Fire Effects Information System. It's basically a database where you can look up any species and it'll give you a report on how it'll interact with fire. Maybe you have a lot of little bluestem and you'd like to get more diversity out there. So you can plug little bluestem in and it'll give you a report on how to both promote and set back little bluestem. And then you could also look up, the species you'd like to increase, like maybe big it's or Indian grass or whatever it may be. And you can look and say, okay, this is what I need to do to promote those, and this is what I need to do to set back little bluestem. And it's a really cool database. So we could throw that link in there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, tons of great resources, it sounds like, Luke, and lots of great information that you shared with us today. I can't thank you enough for coming today and speaking with us about this very important subject for our state this time of year. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
I enjoyed it as well. Once again, everyone, that was Fuel Specialist Luke Berning with the Kansas Forest Service joining us for a conversation on prescribed burns here in Kansas. We're cutting to a short break now, but before we do, we're going to share a quick word from Scarlett Hagans with the Kansas Livestock Association.
The Merck Cartridges for Cash program offers $1,500 scholarships through the Kansas Livestock Foundation to Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine students and $1,000 awards to undergraduates studying animal sciences and planning to be engaged in livestock production. Since Finney County KLA members turned in the most cartridges in 2022, at least one student from that county will receive a Cartridges for Cash scholarship, providing there is a qualified applicant. Hemphill Oil and Mobile Delvac will offer $1,000 scholarships to juniors and seniors at K-State and Fort Hays State University. Go Bob Pipe and Steel will sponsor a $1,000 award for a student sophomore year or above attending a Kansas junior or senior college. Proceeds from the 2022 Kansas Cattlewomen Silent Auction and the Kansas Livestock Foundation Club Calf Sale will fund $1,000 KCW and Youth and Agriculture scholarships. Scholarships in the amount of $1,500 will be offered in memory of Douglas A. Lau, a past KLA Cattle Feeders Council chairman. These will be awarded to juniors or seniors at K-State or Fort Hays State. Glenn and Clyde Lindstrom $1,000 scholarships also are being offered, with preference given to students attending USD 400. A $1,000 scholarship will be offered by Scott Johnson and family to those attending K-State and pursuing a degree in animal sciences, ag communications, agribusiness, or ag economics. A $500 scholarship will be given in memory of Fred H. Woodbury of Quinamo. Students residing in Chase, Franklin, Lyon, Osage, or Wabaunsee counties will be given preference. One application applies to all scholarships and can be accessed by going to kla.org and clicking on Programs. All materials must be digitally submitted by April 21st. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
Once again, we're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. As gardeners get ready to plant their cool season crops, they should grab one of the most neglected garden tools, a soil thermometer, to determine whether the soil is at the right temperature for planting those crops. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says there are several ways to measure soil temperature. Greg, as we start thinking about planting time for certain crops early in the season, one of the things we really need to do is just understand what the soil temperature is, because that's really the determinant as to when we can plant.
That's exactly right. We can use a calendar and kind of go off that, but at least here in Riley County, it's been kind of abnormally warm. So perhaps we can plant a little bit earlier than what our calendar has said. There's lots of resources out there. The K-State Garden Guide is a really good resource to utilize. There's a vegetable planting guide that gives you a calendar. But again, that's just kind of the mean or average time we plant. And this year might be a little bit earlier than normal.
I know sometimes we think because we get a couple of warm days in a row that, okay, it's time to get going, but we also have to remember we've still got some of those really low nighttime lows.
That's right. And so a soil thermometer is probably the best way to go. Now, you can purchase a soil thermometer, and that's great, but there are less expensive ways of doing it. You can get them from the hardware store or the car shop. Typically, it's an air conditioning thermometer, but they're usually cheaper than the soil thermometer. I will go ahead and say I use a meat thermometer, one of the cheaper ones, and just stick that into the ground to get the soil temperature. And you want that to accumulate over time, so we don't, like you said, it's a nice sunny day, stick it out there, and the soil temperature is 55 degrees. Well, that may be at that particular point in time, but as you mentioned, we want a consistent soil temperature, or probably one that's building up in degrees versus, just the hot point of the day.
So how deep do we need to go for this?
So we're looking at where you'd plant your seeds. So if you're planting lettuce seed, of course, that doesn't go very deep at all. Obviously, it's going to be a little early for planting beans, but that's a bigger seed that would be planted deeper in the soil. Typically, we look at 2.5 inches and try to get a good soil temperature reading there. Our earliest vegetables, 40 degrees is probably where I'd start. And once we start to have several days of that, then it's probably going to be okay to plant. Planting when it's too cold, the seed will just sit there. If it's moist, some of that seed may rot, and so that's the disadvantage of planting too early than waiting till it's proper temperature.
And we need to make sure that the garden, I guess, is actually ready to go as well.
That's right. Depends on if you're a no-till gardener or one that likes to aerate the soil and get some oxygen in there. We don't want to do it when it's too wet because that's going to cause problems in most of our clayey soils. But when the soil is just moist enough that you can loosen it up to get that seed into the ground and taking that soil temperature to make sure it's the right temperature for plants to grow. Ideally, we plant vegetables at the right temperature so they grow as quickly as possible and we can reap the harvest before there's lots of weather conditions, insects, diseases, those kind of things that can damage our crop.
Is there still time to do a soil test if somebody would like to?
We can do a soil test anytime. Ideally, do that before you plant, so if we do need to add some nutrients, you get that down into the soil where the root system will take it up. Typically, it takes maybe a week, 10 days to get your results, so hopefully you can plan a little bit ahead of time in case you do need to add something to work into the soil for the season.
And that's something we take over a wider area than we might be doing just for checking the soil temperature?
Yeah, you want to take a bunch of subsamples over the area that you're gardening in. So if you have a 10 by 10 area, you're going to take 5 or 6 samples. Larger area, the more samples you take, subsamples, the better it's going to be. Soil lab will probably just take about 2 cups of your soil. So hopefully you have more than that. Blend it all together. Shout 2 cups into a disposable container and have the soil lab we like to use here in Riley County, K-State's soil lab. It's easy and accurate and affordable as well.
Basically a good time to get started because it's not going to be long before we can actually get out there and get things into the ground.
Yeah, our soil temperatures are climbing at this point, and, your peas are usually the first thing to get planted. St. Patty's Day, we may be planting some seed potatoes, and that's usually typically when we can plant some of our cool season lettuce, radishes, onions, spinach, those things. But again, the soil temperature is the ideal way to determine when to plant.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with tips for using a soil thermometer. Additional information can be found at county and district extension offices. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.